ladies and gentlemen, friends, city staff, elected officials, members of our Richmond High City Council, thank you for being here today. Welcome. It's a great day to play a game of tennis. Our city may only be 2.3 square miles, but we have a lot of history here. We've had famous singers, musicians, aviators, sportscasters, and more call Richmond Heights home. And now we honor two more prominent men in history, Arthur Ashe and Richard Hudlin, along with Dr. Thomas and Mrs. Georgia Rusan and the entire Bennett Avenue neighborhood. We have the pleasure today of hearing many distinguished guest speakers. And so on behalf of the city of Richmond Heights, we're pleased you can join us at the special dedication ceremony. Let me be the first to read one of many proclamations today. Welcome to the Ashe-Hudlin Park. Whereas, on April 15, 2018, the city and its residents give pause and praise at the dedication of the city's newest park, the Ashe-Hudlin Park, located in the Bennett Avenue Historic District, a neighborhood that holds a significance in the civil rights era, developed by and for African American residents by the efforts of the Thomas and Georgia Rusan family. And whereas, this park is a memorial recognizing two African American men, Arthur R. Ashe Jr. and Richard E. Hudlin, former residents of the city of Richmond Heights. And whereas, these two individuals, united by the love of the sport of tennis, came together as a coach, mentor, and student to form a bond that once played out, gave a showcase that challenged segregation on the international tennis sports scene. And whereas, Richard Hudlin, a talented tennis player himself, a Sumner High School coach and teacher, impacted hundreds of young people during his career, helping a number of these talented sports figures to reach for the dreams and overcome racial barriers that separated them from others on the sports scene in the 1950s and the 1960s. Whereas, Arthur R. Ashe Jr. spent his senior year at Sumner High School in the St. Louis and lived with the Hudlins at 1221 Laclede Station Road. And during that time, he was loved, mentored, and coached by Mr. Hudlin, who recognized the talent and skills of young Arthur, a future U.S. Open champion in 1968 and a Wimbledon champion in 1975, and the first African American man to reach that achievement. Now therefore, the Mayor and City Council of the City of Richmond Heights salutes the tradition of this small historic property and asks residents and visitors to the park to pause, study, and reflect on the lives of these two men and remember this neighborhood as a guide path to successful challenges. In witness, we therefore do hereby set our hand and cause the seal of the City of Richmond Heights, Missouri to be affixed on this 15th day of April 2018. Mr. Tim Brusman, would you please come forward? Mr. Brusman, representing our Park and Recreation Department, whose efforts made this park possible. Ms. Marylynn Simms, would you please come up? This is the far area of their property is where the park is, and the original tennis courts are still there. Thank you. And we have a third proclamation and a picture of the park for Dr. Rusan and Mrs. Rusan's daughter, who's not here at this time. She's here? Well, please come up. I'm sorry.
Kennedy, and I am going to be introducing our speakers. We'll go in the same order that they show up on the program. The first person that needs to speak to everybody is Marylynn Simms, who with her husband owns the property where the new park is and also where the former clay tennis court is. So, Marylynn.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to see so many people out to enjoy the dedication of this park. My husband and I have sit outside, and everyone knows George, who runs by, walks by, drives by. He is no stranger to anyone. And we're talking and saying that we would like to have some recognition that Arthur Ashe lived here and that Mr. Hudlin had the home built. And because people pass by all the time wanting to know, did Arthur Ashe live here? Well, our mayor, when he was running to become mayor, came by because he went to every house in Richmond Heights and campaigned. He said he would, if he became mayor, he would definitely do a recognition, and he has lived up to his word. And thank you so very much. My children grew up playing tennis, one of which, Lola, played tennis professionally, and I grew up playing tennis at the Hudlin home when I was a child. Mr. Hudlin made sure that everyone in the neighborhood who was interested in tennis took tennis lessons. So we are thankful for that. Even though the park is a pocket park and it's small in size, it's 1,000 square feet, the significance is large. It's large in that Dr. and Mrs. Rusan developed the neighborhood. And it was during a time where people of color were not welcome in that neighborhood. But they continued, and especially Mrs. Rusan was relentless regarding, yes, we will live here. And so the neighborhood was developed. Mr. Hudlin, who had the home built, he was beyond his years, because who would have thought that in the late 50s, early 60s, someone of color would develop a tennis court and allow people, young children of color, to learn the game of tennis. But he did that. And thirdly, Arthur Ashe was chosen to come to St. Louis because of his superior intellect and athleticism, because of his outstanding tennis skills, and also because of his personality, because he had the perfect and easy personality to deal with what he had to deal with and to continue his tennis career. So it's just a pleasure to reside there, and we are so thankful again that this will be on the map now. Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Joellen.
Thank you, Marylynn. Well, because we had to move this inside and we're not standing where the plaque is located, if you've not been there to see it, I would really encourage you to do so. A lot of the history is contained on the plaque that we can't really review today. I was thinking, what is the thread drawing together all the people who are being honored today? It's certainly more than that they were neighbors. Segregation and the efforts of these people to create opportunities in the face of discrimination is the story behind what we are celebrating. Richard A. Hudlin taught and mentored through teaching tennis many young people, the most famous of whom was Arthur Ashe. In fact, in order to teach tennis in the city of St. Louis, in 1945, Mr. Hudlin had to sue in federal court to get the right for African American children to be able to play tennis in the city parks. So he started even before he actually lived in the neighborhood. Mr. Ashe lived here only 1 year, and he played tennis on the court. Which you can see that is immediately west of the plaque in the small park. He went on to earn international fame in tennis, but continued his legacy after retiring because of his health by establishing and funding foundations to help young people overcome limitations imposed by discrimination. Both Mr. Hudlin and Mr. Ashe well understood the importance of mentoring. Dr. Thomas and Mrs. Georgia Rusan lived in Richmond Heights. In fact, Dr. Rusan grew up in Richmond Heights. When Highway 40 was first being built, their home was in the path of the highway, but they wanted to remain here in their home, and also because Dr. Rusan's parents lived nearby. The property immediately north of their house on the Police Station Road was vacant, and so they determined to purchase it in order to invite other Black professionals to join them in creating a very unique neighborhood. They succeeded, but not without many challenges due to racial bias, including the need to use a straw party to purchase the land. The story of Bennett Avenue Historic District is documented in great detail in the application to have it listed on the National Registry of Historic Places. You can access this entire application online, and I would encourage you to do so. It's probably the most detail you'll find anywhere about the entire neighborhood. The Rusans and their neighbors who built on this land, and both Richard Hudlin and Arthur Ashe, have contributed to our community and deserve the recognition being given to them this day. We thank them and know we are better because they were and are our neighbors. Thank you. Okay, since I am the person who's in charge right now, is Representative Gina Mitten here? Okay. Representative Mitten was going to have a proclamation for the people that are being honored, and this was co-sponsored by Stacy Newman, who also is another representative. They're right here.
They're not here.
No. So we will make sure that we thank them. Oh, is there some? This will contain a lot of the same information that you've already been given, but the resolutions are here. Okay, our next speaker is also going to award a proclamation, and that is St. Louis County Executive Stephen Stenger. I guess I'll ask Dr. Wilson if you want to come up, since this will be.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Wilson.
If I could just take a few moments to read some of the proclamation. I won't read the whole thing, but some of these facts are just, they're really outstanding, and I think that there are things that I think all of us will enjoy hearing and really celebrating. So, whereas Georgia Talia Rusan's courageous efforts broke racial barriers in housing in the 1950s, as she and her husband, Dr. Thomas Rusan Jr., led the effort to establish a modern middle-class subdivision for African Americans in Richmond Heights. And whereas Ms. Rusan, who was an advocate for the poor and helped people secure vital services, overcame fierce opposition from white residents and local governments with legal housing restrictions as the couple developed the property at the Police Station Road and Bennett Avenue into a successful enclave of Black professionals. And whereas in 2008, the National Park Service placed the Bennett Avenue Historic District on the National Register of Historic Places in recognition of the pioneering efforts of Thomas and Georgia Rusan. And whereas Ms. Rusan served the community in the civic and social organization for Black women called the Links, and she was on the Board of Adjustment and Appeals for the City of Richmond Heights for 40 years. And whereas Ms. Rusan garnered numerous awards, including being named a Woman of Achievement in 1975, and she was the first woman and the first African American to receive the Charles Braithwaite Community Leadership Award from the Missouri Association for Community Action in 2001. Now therefore, I, Stephen V. Stenger, St. Louis County Executive, do hereby proclaim April 15, 2018 as Georgia Taylor Rusan Day.
So much. This is a surprise about Georgia Taylor Rusan Day. And I'm so pleased. Thank you so much to the county and for making my mother the honoree for Women's History Month. And I want to make a special thanks for Marylynn and George Simms, whose efforts really brought us to this day. And I see so many of the people I grew up with, both on Bennett Avenue and Richmond Heights. And even though we would like to have spilled out into the street up at Bennett and Laclede Station Road, I have to say that this is both a bittersweet day for me, because my mother really was planning to be here, and I think she probably already had her outfit. Those of you that know my mother know she was quite a dresser. And, but also it's very proper because my father grew up right here where we're sitting and standing on Argus Place, which is where the Heights is, and he simply wanted to build a modern home blocks from where he had grown up, but he was crossing an invisible line, and so the first house he built at Laclede Station Road in Harder, which also doesn't exist anymore, was right across from West Richmond School, and that was a school I walked past every day to go to Lincoln School, because we were segregated. And my parents started their fight because the city actually wanted to pass a bond issue to take their home and make it a park. That was even before Highway 40. And so they organized black and white residents to defeat that bond issue. And then Highway 40 came. So they moved, and I see Michael Kennedy and Ben Davis, who Michael's family joined us even before the highway came in and built a home on Laclede Station Road. And you know, as you've heard, the rest is history. But some of the obstacles, as I've been cleaning out my mother's house since she passed away in January, I've seen all of the suits and other things they had to bring, but also they had to pay for the water and sewer and electric for for more than half of Bennett Avenue. They had to bring it in themselves, and they kept the special tax that they paid, which was over $10,000 in 1956. That was a lot of money. And all the other special taxes that they had to bring in. But I will say that we had a wonderful time growing up on Bennett Avenue. Mr. Hudlin put Ben and Michael and the other young men to work. They had to work for their tennis lessons. They had big rollers that they had to roll out that clay court. And our parents watched us, and we had wonderful parties and other kinds of events, and I do remember seeing Arthur Ashe practice and eavesdropping, because I was a little bit younger, eavesdropping when Arthur Ashe came to our house to ask my father about his choices for college and to ask his advice. So my heart is really full today, and I want to thank everybody that's been involved, and it's just so wonderful to see all my neighbors and to see my cousin, Linda Alton Kennedy, who also grew up in Richmond Heights, and to see my parents' role recognized and my mother's work for social justice and racial justice recognized. So on behalf of my family, my husband, Ernest Wilson, and my son, my oldest son, Malik Wilson, are here as well. We want to thank everyone involved in today's ceremony from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you.
Speech about you. I didn't know where to put it, so I'm going to do it now. After you've heard her speak and give you the history from her family perspective. Dr. Wilson is the daughter of Dr. Thomas and Mrs. Georgia Rusan, and she grew up in Richmond Heights, as she already told us. However, what she didn't say is she is currently an associate professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History at the University of Southern California. She is an intellectual and labor historian whose current research examines the intersections between Black labor movements, Black social scientists, and Black women's history during the Jim Crow era. Her book, Segregated Scholars, Black Social Scientists and the Creation of Black Labor Studies 1890 to 1950, is based on her doctoral research. She was appointed in 2007 by the Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa to the Commission on the Status of Women and served as president of this group from 2009 to 2010. She has served on the boards of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History and the Labor and Working Class History Association. She is a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. And thank you very much for being here today. We also have with us St. Louis County Councilman Pat Dolan. He represents the 5th District, which includes part of Richmond Heights. He's here to present a resolution honoring all the people, Richard Hudlin, Arthur Ashe, as well as Dr. Thomas and Mrs. Georgia Rusan and the Bennett Avenue neighbors.
Well, so I'm the guy who has to follow the doctor. That's how do you top that? Well, thank you for inviting me, and I do represent all of Richmond Heights, for the record. And I'm proud to do that. I live in Richmond Heights, and I'm always bragging about the 5th District, but more importantly, when every chance I get to brag about Richmond Heights, I do that as well. 4th most livable city in the country, I'm told. So and a good reason, a good part of that is because of the perseverance of a lot of people in this room who made it such a diverse and welcoming community now to live in. So thank you all for persevering and bringing us to this event. I do want to acknowledge the mayor and all the representatives from the city of Richmond Heights here for doing this. And also I want to acknowledge Tim. I used to drive by, I'd see George, honking George, and then keep going. I'd see Tim out there working and all their staff, so thank you. Hopefully you'll get a chance to go by and see the park. It's a beautiful park. I do have a resolution here from the St. Louis County Council. It was unanimous resolution from, I'll read it briefly. Whereas on April 15, 2018, the Ashe-Hudlin Memorial Park in Richmond Heights will be dedicated. And whereas at the same ceremony, Dr. Thomas and Georgia Rusan and the Bennett Avenue Historic District will be recognized. Whereas the Ashe-Hudlin Memorial Park dedication recognizes two African-American men linked by a love of and talent for tennis. The late Richard Hudlin and the tennis player he coached and mentored, the late Wimbledon champion Arthur Ashe. Whereas Dr. Thomas and the late Georgia Rusan, along with their neighbors, challenged segregation and led the effort to establish and develop a modern middle-class subdivision for African Americans in Richmond Heights in the area of what is now Laclede Station Road and Bennett Avenue. Whereas the community provided a home for Sumner High School graduate Mr. Ashe during his last year in high school. Whereas in 2008, the National Park Service placed the Bennett Avenue Historic District on the National Register of Historic Places in recognition of the pioneering efforts of Thomas and Georgia Rusan and the district's social and ethnic contributions to St. Louis County's African American history. The County Council congratulates the residents and the leaders of the City of Richmond Heights, as well as all the families and friends of Richard Hudlin, Arthur Ashe, and Dr. and Mrs. Rusan upon the occasion of the Ashe-Hudlin Memorial Park dedication and recognition of Dr. Thomas and Georgia Rusan in the Bennett Avenue Historic District. I didn't have the privilege of meeting Arthur Ashe. I can't proudly say I did know Georgia Rusan, so I think that's even better. So thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Our next speaker is Esley Hamilton. I'm referring to him as Emeritus. He's the St. Louis County Parks and Recreation historian. He retired in 2016 after 39 years of service to St. Louis County as a historic preservationist and consultant, lecturer, author, and writer, volunteer, and friend to many. Esley came at the opening of our 2013 bicentennial and gave a wonderful PowerPoint presentation and really went through the history of Richmond Heights and its position both in the middle of the country and as a part of the state of Missouri. It was a wonderful way for us to start. The last thing I'm going to throw in before he says anything is when Ruth Kenoy and I were working on the application for Bennett Avenue to become a historic district, Esley assigned 2 of his graduate students to come help us do some of the descriptions of the properties. So I thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So much has been said about the significance of the street already that I want to focus for a little bit of a change of pace on the architecture. We have in St. Louis County the Historic Buildings Commission, which is a citizens advisory body on historic preservation that goes back to 1957. It's the oldest preservation government body in the state of Missouri. And they have no regulatory authority, but they have really been active long before I was involved in making our county citizens aware of our historic heritage. And they started back in 2007 when the idea of mid-century modern architecture was just on the horizon to encourage further research here in St. Louis County on that area. And we looked at 400 different subdivisions that were started in St. Louis County after 1940. And when we got to Bennett Avenue, I thought, wow, this is one of the best ones I've seen, particularly because of the ranch houses, which is the thing that everybody wanted, but very few people could get in those early years of modern architecture. And not only does the whole street look great, but there are quite a few significant architects who worked there. For example, the Sinkler's house at 7901 Bennett was designed by Ken Wishmeyer, who designed the loggia at the Muni Theater in Forest Park, the beautiful colonnade in the middle of the park. And he also designed the very first modern supermarket in the region, which is the one that's been closed for many years now, but still standing at the corner of Clayton Road and Hanley. That was the very first one. So he was like a big deal to get to design this house. And the Rusans hired Robert McMahon, who was also a prominent architect, and his family firm is still going today, and I think it's the 4th generation. The first house on the street was you mentioned in 1945 was the first house. Frank Avis, who was a prominent architect, designed that for himself, and he was one of the most progressive architects in the 1930s. He was one of the first architects in St. Louis to use the Art Deco style. Another name that caught my attention, 1228 Laclede, Edward Kelly did whole streets of houses in Ladue, big modern houses, and so he's represented here too. So this, from an architectural point of view, is a treasure. And when it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, it was the first mid-century modern residential district in the state of Missouri to be listed. So this is another aspect of the significance of the street, and particularly when I looked at it, I thought, who wouldn't want to live here? And when you see the struggle that the people had to go through to create this significant neighborhood, it makes it triply significant, I think. And we mentioned the highway causing the Rusans to have to move. The highway also had an impact later, because in recent years when 40 was being widened, they of course wanted to take some of the houses along there. And by having our historic office in Jefferson City saying, no, this is too important, you can't go that way, that helped to preserve it, and it also led to the listing on the National Register of Historic Places. There are several things that happened here twice. It wasn't just once that the city tried to turn it into a park, but twice, in 1945 and in 1950. I can't really add much to what has already been said about the very significant social importance of the street, but it has other importance too that I want you to know about. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Ronald Cobb. He is a writer and historian about tennis in St. Louis. And in 2016, Mr. Cobb was elected to the St. Louis Tennis Hall of Fame.
I'd like to say a few words about Arthur Ashe, and for some of you who are well-versed in tennis, you may have heard some of this information, but hopefully others, it will be new. When Arthur was living at Laclede Station Road in Bennett Avenue during the 1960-61 school year, I was living just a few blocks east of here on Alamo Avenue next to the old CBC High School. And when Arthur was a senior at Sumner, I was in 5th grade at DeMund School. In the fall of 1960, John F. Kennedy visited St. Louis during his campaign for president, and his motorcade came to Richmond Heights. Kennedy came west on Clayton Road and turned left onto Big Bend, just a few blocks from where we are now. My father and I were standing on Big Bend as Kennedy came by, waving as he went. And it has occurred to me that it's possible that Mr. Hudlin brought Arthur to see Kennedy too, and we might even have been standing just a few feet from each other. But as far as I know, our paths never crossed that year. But they did later on when I covered tennis, first for a newspaper in Memphis, and then at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I was fortunate in that I was able to interview Arthur on several occasions. But even before I ever interviewed him, I always liked Arthur Ashe. To me, he represented everything that was good about tennis and sports in general. He was a gentleman, he was a role model, and a scholar. And he was the best goodwill ambassador tennis has ever had. And his work on social and humanitarian causes was something to admire. In 1975, when Arthur advanced to the singles final at Wimbledon, his opponent was an ill-mannered youngster from this area who was the defending Wimbledon champion. It was a matchup of polar opposites. Arthur Ashe, polite and composed, against Jimmy Connors, rude and arrogant. Arthur won that day in 4 sets. One might think that as someone who grew up in St. Louis, my favorite, most memorable sports event would be a Cardinals World Series victory, or a Rams Super Bowl, or a St. Louis Hawks NBA championship. But it wasn't any of those. To this day, Arthur's victory on that day in 1975 remains the most enjoyable sports event I've ever seen. I was incredibly happy with the way it turned out. 7 years later, in 1982, Arthur came back to St. Louis as captain of the U.S. Davis Cup team for a quarterfinal match against Sweden. A couple of weeks before the event, I had a long telephone conversation with Arthur for a story that I wrote for the Post-Dispatch. In that interview, he told me that St. Louis was one of the sine qua non of his tennis career. And what he meant by that was that his career would not have been what it turned out to be had he not spent a year here, living with Richard and Jane Hudlin, going to school at Sumner, and most important in terms of his tennis game, playing against this city's best tennis players. In that interview, Arthur told me that during the time he was here, St. Louis had the strongest tennis of any city in the country outside of the greater Los Angeles area. And equally important, before the advent of indoor tennis clubs, which came along in the late 60s, St. Louis had only one place to play tennis during the winter, and that was at the old 138 Infantry Armory on Market Street. Because one of the Army majors at the Armory was a top tennis player in St. Louis, they painted lines on the wooden floor of the indoor drill area to create 5 tennis courts, and the public was invited to play on those courts when they were available. On that wooden surface, any ball that hit the court skidded and stayed low, making it hard to play from the baseline. So really, the only way to play tennis at the Armory was to come to net, catch the ball before it skidded on the wood. So during his time here, Arthur, who before coming to St. Louis was primarily a baseline player, was forced to develop a serve and volley game, which came in very handy during his professional career. And that is why he referred to his time in St. Louis as a sine qua non. Before I conclude, I want to tell one more story that speaks volumes about the kind of person Arthur was. In 1992, Mr. Hudlin was to be inducted posthumously into the St. Louis Tennis Hall of Fame. Arthur had already been diagnosed with AIDS, which at that time was tantamount to a death sentence. He knew his days on earth were numbered, and I'm sure he would have loved to spend the weekend at home in New York with his wife and daughter. But he chose to travel to St. Louis to honor Mr. Hudlin and to serve as MC of the induction ceremony at AAA Club. I was honored to write a large portion of the speech that Arthur delivered that day, and I'm honored to be here today for the dedication of Ashe-Hudlin Park. It's reassuring to know that thanks to the vision, the hard work, and diligence of the city of Richmond Heights, of Marylynn, Joellen, and others, that people who pass by 1221 Laflette Station Road from this point forward will be able to learn about the role that that home and that land played in tennis history. Thank you.
Thank you. That was was history that I was unaware of, a lot of it, so I appreciate that information. Our next speaker is Judith Pruitt. Mrs. Pruitt is a 1961 Sumner graduate and was a classmate of Arthur Ashe. He also mentored her son, Christian Hill, who was a tennis professional in ATA and USTA youth tennis. Mrs. Pruitt was a fundraising consultant for Black Americans in Flight, which produced the mural that stretches along the wall at our airport as you head towards the baggage claim. One of the men pictured in that mural is Charles White, who lived in Richmond Heights and died a few years ago. He was a Tuskegee Airman, and the Richmond Heights Historical Society dedicated a brick in his memory where we have the whole, what I should call a dedication to any veterans. It's on the west side of the grounds here. Mrs. Pruitt her parents were friends of the Hudlins, and her mother and Mrs. Rusan were members of the same social club. So she will give us a different perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. And congratulations to Richmond Heights and all the things that are going on out here. I am a tennis mother. You've heard of the tennis mothers, and that's what I am. I did graduate with Arthur Ashe in 1961, June, from Sumner High School. My brother, prior to me graduating, was one of Mr. Hudlin's students of tennis. He said he used to get beat up all the time when he was going back to the tennis courts in the evening because the guys thought, I don't know what they thought, but he said he would have to run and go play. But anyway, I come from a long line of people that play tennis, and thanks to St. Louis, Richmond Heights, and all the people in this area that helped and supported my son and others that were playing tennis during the time that Chris came along in junior tennis. I'd like to thank Match. I'd like to thank the net rushers and many, many other people, Carl Walker, Cameron Thomas. I don't want to leave out everybody, but we had a lot of support. And the reason I'm bringing up support came from the legacy of Hudlin and Arthur Ashe. And there were people that supported us. Chris went on, my son went on to continue to play junior tennis on a high level along with Kenneth Powell and some other players that's here right now. They had, one of the things, let me just say this, one of the things that I found about tennis that I learned as a tennis mother is the people, you learn so much from everybody. You learn so many things from everybody that it's just been a pleasure for me to meet all the people that I have met, all the youngsters that have grown up through tennis, and again with Arthur. During the time Chris was in junior tennis, in his last year of high school, Arthur contacted him to come to New York and to Florida for some meetings. And they became, they talked about some things. And Arthur encouraged Chris to continue to finish school, do not play professional tennis until you finish college. And that's what he did. During the time he went to college, and he had the pleasure of going to Pepperdine University, and his coach was Alan Fox, who was a player with Arthur Ashe. So I'm saying this because it all comes full circle. He's helped many students, and right now Chris is currently working in the Philadelphia area. He worked for the University of Pennsylvania. He was a coach there, and he currently works independently. However, without the mentorship of Arthur and without Hudlin mentoring Arthur, Chris probably wouldn't have gotten as far as he did. He worked with Venus and Serena. He's worked with a ton of tennis folk. But the thing is, he told me to tell everybody is that even, as we go along this way, the two kids that he really helped, the Jenkins brothers, who are now with Venus and Serena, they were some of the people that he mentored. So again, we'd like to thank this community, but really thank Mr. Hudlin and Arthur, who brought us all full circle, and we will never forget that. And being a tennis mother isn't very easy, but we met a lot of nice people, and I'm proud of what we did. Thank you.
Our next person who's going to come up here is Linda Alton Kennedy, and Marylynn already introduced her as a cousin, which I did not know. She's a longtime resident of Richmond Heights and an award-winning actress, director, costume designer, theater and dance teacher. Ms. Kennedy is the 2012 recipient of the Lifetime Achievement in the Arts Award from the St. Louis Regional Arts and Education Council, among numerous other awards. Ms. Kennedy will do a poetry reading.
Thank you. I'm going to attempt to play this song on my phone and hope that it doesn't ring while I'm attempting to play it. And it's quite fitting that I do this because it's being played by my partner. His name is Adrian Bowers, and Adrian was a graduate of Sumner. So I'm going to see if this works. And when I die, when the old spirit spurts into God's unseen air, don't shed one tear, sisters and brothers. Instead, rejoice with song and prayer. Paint landscapes of heaven for the eyes of our children. Please don't grieve my departure, for we shall meet again in time. I'll be watching and waiting for your time, and hand you a real freedom to wrap around your shoulders like a magic, marvelous cape. So when I cross that river, don't get dressed in dark colors and collapse before useless coffins or cry, when you could be wishing me well. Please don't waste your words on endless oratory and kill several others with boredom or dollar. When the sun is still shining all golden, just believe that our span of time is ultimately God's piece of time. I'm going to say that again. Just remember that our span of time is ultimately God's piece of time. And say this time he was a poet. And that this time he was black. And that this time he was black. And at this time he was black. And next time there's just no telling how he may come back. How he may come back. Thank you.
We are going to show a video that was produced by people here at the community center, and also cut the ribbon, even though it's not at the official site. And then we're going to conclude the program with a prayer by Pastor Burrow. We'll now do the symbolic ribbon cutting, and then we'll end with a prayer. Jim Thomson, Marylynn, Dr. Wilson, please step up here.
Let me hold this until he pulls it out. Come on back here, give me a hand. When I say I'll pull that. Hold his hand. 2, 3.
Pastor Burrow, if you would come up and conclude this dedication ceremony with a prayer. Pastor Burrow is the pastor of First Church of God in Richmond Heights.
Thank you. If
you would like, if you would please stand, I would appreciate it. And simply thank God for everything that has happened on today. And the dedication ceremony for the Ashe-Hudlin Park. Father, we thank you so much because of how good you are unto us. Lord, we are so grateful on today for how you have blessed this community, Lord, to come together and show yourself mighty on behalf of those whose hearts are turned toward you when efforts of working together has to be done. And then, Lord, we just want to pray the prayer that you taught us to pray. And if you'll join me, everyone, our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and give us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory. Amen. God bless you. Have a great time at the reception.
Thank you, Pastor.
There's a cake in the back that is dedicated to this whole event, and some water and some lemonade, so help yourself.